أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وعظيمنا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين المنتجبين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم ثم تلين جلودهم وقلوبهم إلى ذكر الله. ذلك هدى الله يهدي به من يشاء ومن يضلل الله فما له من هاد. صدق الله العلي العظيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
The invention of writing, the ability to document our thoughts, our complex ideas, our culture into some sort of medium, whether it was stone, whether it was bamboo, whether it was papyrus, leather, whatever the medium was, it was discovered over different places of the world at different times in people's history. But whenever it came forward, it transformed the identity of those people. Because for the first time, they were able to record their thoughts and the deeper aspects of their discussions that they would have and the highest forms of their ideas in a place which, number one, would not change, unlike the oral tradition which existed before. And number two, it could be taken out of the zeitgeist of the time. So normally with the oral tradition, if you had a story, for example, it would generally be told in that one specific place at that one specific time, maybe over the course of a few generations. But once it was committed to writing, it could be seen many years afterwards, and it could be seen by people who were not from that background and from that culture. And so the discovery of writing is one of the most important ones in the history of mankind. And we recorded a lot of different things in print. One was stores of information, that we had some slightly mundane record books, perhaps the laws of a country. There are lots of old ancient archaeological evidence that we have to that regard, especially things that were written in stone. But there was another type of writing that developed, which was perhaps even more impactful on the psyche of man, and that was literature. That is records and writing of people's thoughts with an artistic leaning, that there is some sort of artistic angle to it. And great literature, as it has evolved over the centuries, over the millennia, it has the ability to change us, to move us. For example, if we pick up a book of fiction and we read a story, through that story we are able to transport ourselves through time, through space, through different dimensions, and even into different consciousnesses, especially when we read in the first person. There's a quote which captures this quite well from the Martian Chronicles, which it itself is a form of fiction. The author, he's describing a library, and he says that the library When rivers flooded and fire fell from the sky, what a fine place the library was. The many rooms and books. With luck no one found you, but how could they? When you were off to Tanganyika in 98, Cairo in 1812, and Florence in 1492. So we transport ourselves through time and space when we read fiction. When we read poetry, we swim in the spiritual ecstasy of the author, of the poet. And in doing so, again, we reach past the superficial aspects of our consciousness, and we reach something deeper. When we read the works, for example, of great mystics and great wise sages of old, we can look into the minds of some of the greatest people who have walked the earth. For example, we can see from Marcus Aurelius's Meditations some of the profundity of the Stoic philosophy. We can see Confucianism in the writings that surround him, or Lao Tzu, or any of the main sages of history. We have access to their works even today. And another form of literature that has affected mankind over time is holy books. And there have been a number of different holy books for different religions. In Western civilization, it has leaned very heavily on the Torah and on the Bible. In other places, when you move to Far East Asia, for example, you have the Lotus Sutra for Buddhism. When you look at Hinduism, for example, you have the Mahabharata, of which the Gita is a subsection. And they have had their own impacts on the different cultures in which they emerged from. And the artistic bend in these works, one of the things that it is able to do, which when we pick up a book of fiction, it is not possible to do, not always, is that it peels back the layers of our conscious. Now, inshallah, we'll have a discussion in the coming nights about the difference between the conscious and the subconscious. But when we engage in a work actively, and we look at information on a page, we engage it using the part of our brains which are conscious. But the majority of ourselves and what makes us who we are lies underneath that. And it's very difficult to access. And we kind of know that from day-to-day life, right? If we have a habit, for example, that we're trying to break, we know logically that we need to change it, but for some reason it doesn't work. And that's because the subconscious is overpowering us. So when we read works of non-fiction, it's difficult to get past that layer. But when we read great literature and artistic works, it peels back those layers of the conscious. And we are exposed to that underlying substrate that makes us who we are. And then whatever we are reading, it reaches deep into that, and it can change who we are. And it can inspire us, it can galvanize us, it can frighten us, it can morph us, it can revolutionize us. All these are impacts from these great works that it can have on us. And that can happen individually, but it can also happen to a society at large. For example, Shakespeare brought in about 1,700 words into the English language that did not exist before he wrote his plays. Or, if we look at Michael Cervantes in Spain, through his work Don Quixote, he was able to bring the entire language of Spain together. So sometimes it is actually known as his language. Just one work of fiction, the amount of impact that it had on that region. And of course, the Islamic world is no stranger to great literature either. We have, for example, at the height of everything in Islamic civilization, we have the Holy Quran of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Quran, of course, it is head and shoulders above anything else. Because it is not just the words of man, it is the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He knows exactly how to reach down into our subconscious. It is the most memorized book in history. And it is the second most printed book, and it is the fabric that binds about 1/3 of the world's population, and it brings one of the world's most spoken languages together. And without the Holy Quran, it's possible that Arabic would have fragmented into other languages rather than just into other dialects as we find it today. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He recognizes this about the Holy Quran. Hence He says in Surah Al-Zumar, the surah that I recited at the beginning, the verse from the beginning, He says that God has sent down the most beautiful of teachings, Ahsanul Hadith, a scripture that is consistent and draws comparisons, that causes the skin of those in awe of their Lord to crawl. And their skins and their hearts, they soften at the mention of God. And such is God's guidance. And what's interesting here is that in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He's talking about the impact the Quran has on us, He's referring not to the conscious, because the skin crawling and the heart softening is not something that we can do on demand, but it is something that the Quran reaches down into the substrate of our being, and it manages to affect it in that respect.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
And in the annals of Islamic literature, there are other works that we can find. 1001 Arabian Nights is one of the most famous, as a larger story with a subset of smaller stories within. There's Kalila wa Dimna, which is actually not an Arabic work. It was translated from Sanskrit, but after its translation, it became a canon of classic Islamic literature. But amongst these other aspects of literature, within the Islamic world, we find, apart from the Holy Quran, which again is in a category of its own, head and shoulders above the rest is poetry. Some of the greatest poets from the history of mankind, they have come from Islamic civilizations. People like Hafiz, Sa'idi, A'tar, Jalaluddin Rumi, all these great poets who are not only recognized and celebrated within the Islamic world, but they often find themselves as best-selling poets in the Western world as well, outside of the cultural context of their writings, which for poetry is something quite incredible. And there are underappreciated works within the annals of Islamic literature, which although they have the word Islamic attached to them, as Muslims who claim to be followers of this religion, we have neglected them. And Ayatollah Mutahhari, who is one of the most celebrated Shia scholars of the last century or two, he is the scholar who wrote a number of very deep, insightful philosophical treatises where he took very complex concepts and he processed them in a way and wrote in such an eloquent style that it became accessible to the masses. It is very difficult to study Islam without looking at his works. And he was, on a more sort of pragmatic side of things, in Iran, he was responsible for keeping communism at bay. Marxism, it was rising up in the universities, and the treatises he wrote were most important in turning the youth away from something that experience would later show was a disaster. So he was a very important scholar. And he writes, in the book that we'll use quite heavily over these coming nights, about a work of literature that we have neglected. And he gives an analogy, he gives a story. He says, imagine that you have someone in your neighborhood, maybe even your neighbor, who you encounter on a daily basis. Every day, you come across them, you say hi to them, you nod, you say salam, but there's not much else other than that. And this goes on for years. And if someone asks you about them, you'd probably be able to say their name. You'd probably be able to say one or two things about them, but that's it. If anyone wants more information, they wouldn't be able to do so. And so, this happens for some time until we reach the point where by accident, for some reason, we are able to sit down and speak with them. And when we speak with this person, we realize that they are a treasure trove of knowledge and wisdom. And the conversations that we have with them leave us enlightened. And we find that this person truly is someone special. And from then on, whenever we interact with them, whenever we run into them, it's not an ordinary interaction. It's something special. Their face seems to have changed. Their presence has a different weight. And now when we see them in a different light. And Ayatollah Mutahhari, he comes from a scholarly background. And so he saw this book that he's referring to within his household. He saw it in the hawza regularly. But it was some time before it clicked, before he took his relationship with it to the next level. And despite knowing the importance of literature, both in terms of gaining direct knowledge from learning and indirect from deeper experiences, we neglect some of our important works. And 2 years ago, we were discussing the Holy Quran. We looked at the tafsir of some of the surahs of the Holy Quran with the hope that using that framework going forward, we could look at other surahs of the Quran and understand it in more depth. Last year, we looked at Risalatul Huquq, the treatise of rights by Imam Zayn al-Abidin salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
And inshallah, in tonight's discussion and as the topic for the series of these discussions, we will look at one of the most important works of Islamic literature, the one that Ayatollah Mutahhari is talking about, and that is Nahjul Balagha, the peak of eloquence, which is the words of Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
And Sheikh Muhammad Abdu, who we talk about in some more detail later on in tomorrow's discussion, he writes that the unfamiliarity of Nahjul Balagha with the Sunni Muslims is not something to be surprised about, but in its unfamiliarity with the Shi'as of Ahlul Bayt, with those upon whom he is supposed to be at home, that is indeed most strange. But in order to appreciate it, in order to be able to take our relationship with him to the next level, it's important to have some sort of taste of the wisdom and the treasures that lie between the covers of this great book. And for Ayatollah Mutahhari, he had a teacher by the name of Ayatollah Isfahani. And he was a very masterful teacher who had mastery over a number of different subjects. But the subject which had the biggest impact on him was Nahjul Balagha. And this is how Ayatollah Mutahhari, how he describes him. He says, it was evident that he lived on Nahjul Balagha. He lived it and he breathed it. His spirit was united with this book. His pulse throbbed and his heart beat in harmony with Nahjul Balagha. Its sentences were forever on his lips and its meanings were engraved within his heart. And when he quoted passages, tears would flow from his eyes and they would soak his grey beard. And it was after witnessing this and receiving the wisdom from his teacher that Ayatollah Mutahhari, he developed that new relationship with Nahjul Balagha. And he went on to write a work called Glimpses from Nahjul Balagha, which is one of the most important works concerning it. Now, of course, there is no Ayatollah Isfahani sitting before you today. And most likely, there is no Ayatollah Mutahhari sitting in the crowd either. So we won't be able to get to that level. But the hope is that over these nights, we can unlock some of the treasures of Nahjul Balagha, that we can get a taste, so that in our own time we can open up this holy work and take the benefit out from it that we have left neglected all these years. Now, the relationship that we have with Nahjul Balagha, it is quite well established. Because most of us will have heard that name before, even if we don't know anything else about it other than the name. Peak of eloquence, that alone shows that there is some distant familiarity with it. But it also affects us in our lives as well, because we've probably come across quotes and sayings from it that we don't otherwise appreciate, that we don't realize came from Nahjul Balagha. And we'll look at a couple of examples just to show that we have some relationship with the book, we just don't know it yet. For example, the statement of Imam Ali that he who is not my brother in religion is my equal in humanity. That is from Nahjul Balagha, his letter to Malik al-Ashtar. When he says, he sits in the masjid of Kufa and he says, Saluni qabla an tufqiduni, ask me before you lose me, that is in Nahjul Balagha. When Imam says that meet people in such a way that when you have passed away, they weep over you, and when you are alive, they long for you. Again, that is Nahjul Balagha. In another saying, he says that worshippers are of three types. One who worships Allah because they want reward. This is the worship of a businessman. Another worships Allah out of fear. This is the worship of the slave. And a third worships Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because he is worthy of worship. And this is the worship of a free man. Again, this is Nahjul Balagha. On the occasion of Eid, Imam, when he is giving his sermon and he is talking about the festivities of the day, he says, yes, today is an Eid, but every day in which you do not sin, that is also an Eid. Again, that saying of the Imam, it is in Nahjul Balagha. So what exactly is this work? When we pick up a copy of the book, what are we expecting to find in between its covers? It's a collection of sermons, about 240, most of which are quite short. Letters, about 78, and maxims, wise aphorisms, sayings of the Imam, which number just under 500. And the subtitle of the book, it is Nahjul Balagha, the peak of eloquence, the height of eloquence, and the subtitle of it is a selection of the sermons, letters and sayings of Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi.
Allahumma salli ala
Now, during the time of the Imam, speeches, they tended to be quite short. They were relatively short in their delivery. And poetry, it was much longer. And the Imam in Nahjul Balagha, generally speaking, his sermons are on the shorter side. Some of them are excerpts of longer sermons, but there are some lengthy sermons in there as well. And the topic of speeches before the Imam and before the Holy Prophet, the topics of speeches would be vanity. People would talk about being prideful about their lineage. They would talk about poetry. They would boast about their exploits in war. They would talk about love. They would talk about wine. They would talk about anything frivolous. And that was what they got the people to engage with. But we find none of that in Nahjul Balagha, because that was one of the ways in which the Imam helped the transformation of the pulpit from being a place of obscenity and a place of vanity into a source of knowledge and a source of wisdom. And within the book, he covers a number of different topics, ranging from all over different aspects of Islam. For example, he talks about ideology, he talks about belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he talks about the nature of God, the Quran, the Holy Prophet, Imamah, Qiyamah, he talks about Ahlul Bayt, so on and so forth, the basic edicts of faith. He talks about this world and he talks about the Akhirah. He talks about adab, about how we should live our lives morally. He talks about akhlaq. He talks about psychology. He talks about knowledge. He talks about ibadah, du'as, the position of Ahlul Bayt. And much of it is devoted to politics as well. Because most of Nahjul Balagha, it contains the sermon sayings and the lectures of the Imam whilst he was Khalifa, during the last years of his lifetime. So he talks about oppression a lot. He talks about dealing with his governors. There's lots of rebukes of his enemies. There's lots of letters which are written to his foes. And we'll discuss them, inshallah, in the coming nights. He talks about war, he talks about bravery, future predictions, critiques of modern society, social philosophy, and a number of other subjects. The point of this list is to get us to appreciate that Nahjul Balagha is a multivaried work. It is not just on one subject. It is not just on a paucity of subjects, but on many of them. And it is a collection of, and the sources that the compiler used, and he took about 17 years to bring it together. It includes sermons that he gave at Eid, sermons from Salatul Jumu'ah. It contains, for example, councils, discussions that he had with his friends, letters that he wrote to his friends, letters he wrote to his enemies, wills, particularly to Imam Hassan alayhi salam. Lots of different sources that we have that were put together in a multivaried work. In short, one way to understand Nahjul Balagha is to see it as a window into the mind of the Imam. It is a unique opportunity to see how the brain of Imam Ali alayhi salam, how it functioned and how it thought. And about Nahjul Balagha, about the words of the Imam, people would say that the words of Imam Ali alayhi salam are duna kalam al-khaliq wa fawqa kalam al-makhluq. That they are below the words of the Creator, but they are above the words of the creation. And it's a beautiful description of the words of the Imam. Now, of course, when we're saying above the words of creation, it refers to ordinary creation, not, of course, to the words of the Holy Prophet. His words are much higher. But it is something almost otherworldly, something that no other person could come up with. And in the same way that Shi'as argue that the Quran is part of the evidence of the prophethood of Rasul al-A'zam Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, we say that Nahjul Balagha is a portion of the evidence of the imamat of the first Imam. And that can be in the strong sense, in that we say that it proves that he has some sort of divine connection, that no one without that direct connection to God can have words so beautiful, but also in a weaker sense as well, in that you can argue, even without the belief in Imamah, that the eloquence of the Imam, the wisdom that he gives us, is beyond what any other ordinary human could give us. So how does it compare to the classics of literature? When we look at all the other great books in the history of Islamic literature, where does Nahjul Balagha stand? Well, it's only really possible to compare books or authors who are working in the similar category. So, for example, if we picked up a book from, let's say, Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist, and we tried to compare it to the poetry of someone like T.S. Eliot, we wouldn't be able to get very far, because they're completely different domains. And the Imam, he actually comments on this himself in Nahjul Balagha in saying 455. He says, when he is asked who the best of all poets are, he says all poets did not tread one and the same path, so that you may tell who was the leader and who was the follower. So to compare it is difficult. But what we can say is by looking at any individual author or work, we can say that indeed they were a master of that category. And Nahjul Balagha, it is in a unique category of its own. There is no other book quite like it that talks about so many different subjects in such a way. And if it was from any other author other than the Imam, it would have been disjointed, it would have been disconnected, it would have been difficult to read, it would have been torturous. But because it is from the Imam and it is weaved with the most beautiful of words, we're able to navigate it with the utmost pleasure. It is an enjoyable read. And this disparate approach, this bringing together of what is sometimes antithetical, contradictory qualities in one, is somewhat reflective of the underlying personality of the Imam. Because Imam Ali alayhi salam, in many ways, he was a walking contradiction. He had multiple qualities within one person that you don't normally see. For example, someone who is brave and harsh on the battlefield, you don't expect them to be kind and caring at home or to those who they look after. And Ayatul Mutahhari, he has a separate book devoted to this exact topic, the polarization of the character of Imam Ali. And he says that about the Imam being multidimensional, that he is a ruler, a just ruler, but a devotee who stays awake worshipping all night. He weeps in the mihrab, in the masjid, in that place where the Imam recites, but he smiles on the battlefield. He is a tough warrior and a soft-hearted and kind guardian. He is a philosopher of profound insight, but also a capable general. All of these qualities, you don't tend to see them both in the same person. Someone who philosophizes and theorizes, generally they're in the world of ideology. And someone who's a general, they're in the world of pragmatism, of practice. But the Imam combines them seamlessly. He goes on to say that he is a teacher, a preacher, a judge, a jurist, a peasant, a writer. He is a perfect man whose great soul envelops all spheres of the human spirit. And that disparate nature crystallizes itself in Nahjul Balagha. Ayatul Mutahhari, he goes on to quote the poet Safi ad-Din al-Hilli, who says the following about him. He says about Imam Ali, the opposites have come together in your attributes, and for that you have no rivals. A devout ruler, a man of forbearance, a courageous one, a lethal warrior, an ascetic, a pauper, yet generous to others. Traits which never gathered in one man, and the like of which no one ever possessed. A gentleness and a charm to abash the morning breeze, a valor that might melt sturdy rocks. Poetry cannot describe the glory of your soul. Your multifaceted personality is above the comprehension of all critics.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
So now that we've spoken a little bit about what Nahjul Balagha is, it's important to discuss what Nahjul Balagha is not. Because sometimes we pick up this book with a certain expectation in mind. We read the first sermon, we get confused and lost, we go into number 2, number 3, and then we close it. Because it wasn't what we expected. So exactly what is Nahjul Balagha not? Nahjul Balagha is not a comprehensive collection of hadith. If you pick up, for example, a copy of Usul al-Kafi or Sahih al-Bukhari or any other book of hadith, compilation, you'll find that it is well referenced, you'll find chains of narration, you'll find it organized as per the topic. There'll be a book on Tawheed, a book on the companions of the Prophet, a book on akhlaq, so on and so forth. But that's not the case with Nahjul Balagha. That's one thing it is not. Another thing that it is not is a narrative history. You don't pick it up starting from one point and see that it traverses through time. So it starts at the beginning and it finishes at the end. That doesn't happen in Nahjul Balagha either. It's not a systematic dissection of Islam. There are many concepts that it doesn't dive into in much depth. And there are other concepts that it dives into much more than other works. And finally, it is not a book which is 100% authentic. In the school of Ahlul Bayt, there is only one book which is completely undeniably authentic from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is the Holy Quran. Any other book that comes, no matter how respected, no matter how authoritative it is, we cannot call it a sahih. Within Shia Islam, we don't accept everything within it. And when you look through Nahjul Balagha, there'll be parts that when we open up, we sort of feel it's a little bit disconnected. Maybe that part doesn't belong here. Maybe this comes from a weak narration, a weak background. And there's one subject in particular, but inshallah in tomorrow night's discussion, we'll go through in detail about the authenticity of Nahjul Balagha. So when you read it, every sermon you read, every letter you look at, every wise saying that we absorb, they are their own unique microcosm. They exist within themselves, not relating to the one after or the one before. Though sometimes you can link a number of themes together, which is what we're going to try and do over these coming nights. And what was the context of the time that Imam Ali alayhi salam had spoken, and then over which time period were they then collected? So the compiler, he lived in a time during the Islamic Golden Age, but at a time when the Abbasids, who were the ruling khulafa of the time, they had lost a little bit of power. They no longer had complete hegemony. The Turks were rising in power. There were other empires as well, one of which was a Shia empire known as the Buyids. First they were Zaydi Shias, they then converted over to Twelver Shias. And in this time, they had Baghdad for some time, they let it go for other times. But it was a very tolerant period in Islamic history. Because normally, when we look particularly at the history of Shia scholars, there's a lot of oppression because they are in the minority. The opinions they bring forward sometimes are not accepted by the majority. But during this time, they were able to publish whatever they wanted. So many of the greatest ulama in Shia history came from this time. People like Sheikh al-Mufid, Sheikh al-Murtada, Sheikh, for example, al-Tusi, Sheikh al-Saduq. All of these people came from around this time period. And it was such a tolerant time that you could publish your idea. You could publish a book. And someone would read it, they would disagree, so they would publish their rebuttal. Someone would read the rebuttal, they would not like it, so they would publish a rebuttal to the rebuttal. So there was a lot of saber rattling that took place because it was an open academic environment. And there were a lot more complex issues that had developed as well. Theologically, Islam had moved on. Earlier on, when the Holy Prophet, he would give sermons, when he would teach, it was in a time where Muslims were one community. It hadn't spread as far and wide as it had during the time of Imam Ali. Before, for example, the Romans had not been subjugated, the Byzantines. For example, the Iranians hadn't been defeated. Egypt had not been conquered. But with their conquering, with their taking over, there was a huge influx of new philosophical thoughts. And not only from a theoretical perspective, from a practical perspective, people changed as well. Because there was an influx of wealth, the likes of which had never been seen before. And we'll discuss that in one of the upcoming nights, inshallah. And so the Imam, he had a unique opportunity to dive in some depth in certain subjects that Rasulullah only touched upon. And for 250 years, Nahjul Balagha, it stood unrefuted. Nobody published a rebuttal to Nahjul Balagha. No one published any doubts concerning it because it contained things that everybody at the time, they knew that it was from the Imam. So we've spoken a lot about Nahjul Balagha. But what about the compiler? Who is the person that put them together? The compiler is known as Sharif al-Radi. He was born in 359 after Hijrah, and he passed away in 406 after Hijrah. He was 47 years of age. He was the 12th descendant of Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. And he was the 5th descendant of Imam al-Kadhim, the 7th Imam. Now, about him, there's an interesting story that Ibn al-Hadid, he's a Mu'tazilite Sunni scholar who has written Sharh Nahjul Balagha, which is the most comprehensive and authoritative commentary on Nahjul Balagha. He writes that Sheikh al-Mufid, one of the giants in the history of Shia Islam, he was the greatest scholar of his time. He was sitting in his mosque in Baghdad, and he had fallen asleep. And in his dream, Lady Fatima al-Zahra, Sayyidatu Nisa al-Alam, she came forward to him. And she came with her 2 sons, Imam al-Hassan and Imam al-Hussein. And she said, "O Shaykh al-Mufid, I would like you to teach my 2 sons." And Shaykh al-Mufid, he woke up after this. And he was a little bit confused. Because what does this mean? Because of course Shaykh al-Mufid, he cannot teach Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein alayhi salam. They are far more educated than him. So what does this mean? He did not know. until later that day, there was a lady by the name of Fatima bint Nasir. She entered into the masjid and she said, Assalamu alaikum, my name is Fatima and I want you to educate my two sons. And her two sons were al-Murtada and al-Radi. Now, Sheikh al-Murtada, he was the inheritor of the crown of the greatest Shia scholar of his time. He was al-A'la. Just as Sheikh al-Mufid was before him, Sheikh al-Murtada was after him. And following him was Sheikh al-Tusi. And they were established in Baghdad during this time. The Hawza was there, which was the beating heart of the Islamic Golden Age. But during the life of Sheikh al-Tusi, people became intolerant. It was not during the rule of the Buyids. They actually burned his library. So he took the Hawza away from Baghdad and he went over to Najaf. And that's where he established the great Hawza of Najaf. So that was the older brother, Sheikh al-Murtada. The younger brother, he was not a marja' of taqleed like his older brother, but rather he was a poet. He was more interested in literature, in eloquence, and in mastery of the Arabic language. He had a contemporary by the name of Tha'labi. Tha'labi was a master of literature and poetry himself. And he bears testimony, Muhammad Abdu, who again we'll talk about tomorrow in a bit more detail, in his introduction to his commentary on Nahjul Balagha, he quotes Tha'labi as saying about Sharif al-Radi, he is the most remarkable man, and amongst his contemporaries he is the noblest amongst the Sayyids of Iraq. Family descent aside, he is fully adorned and endowed with literary excellence. He is the most remarkable poet amongst the descendants of Abu Talib, though there are many distinguished poets among them. To say that of all the tribesmen of Quraysh no poet could ever surpass him would not be an exaggeration. So there's a great respect that he has for Sharif al-Radi because he was well known at his time. He was a very reputable scholar. And he compiled it over 17 years with only one intention in mind. Again, he wasn't trying to put together a comprehensive or an authentic or a fully rigorous book of hadith, but rather he wanted to build something that was based on adab, which was based on eloquence. And so he gathers these different sayings, sermons and lectures from the Imam based on the Arabic that the Imam used, which was in some of the most brilliant Arabic of the time. And what is very important to recognize about Nahjul Balagha is that Sharif al-Radi, he does not give the chains of narration. Normally when we have a hadith or we have a narration, if there is a gap between two people, because Sharif al-Radi, he didn't come immediately after the Imam, he couldn't hear them directly, he came hundreds of years afterwards. So normally someone would say, I heard this, but I got it from this source, who got it from that source, who got it from that source, until it's traced back to the original person. And that's one way in which we can authenticate a narration. But Sharif al-Radi, he does not include them in Nahjul Balagha. Now this does not impede its authenticity, as we will inshallah discuss in tomorrow night's discussion in some detail, because it's a very important discussion. So Sharif al-Radi, when he is introducing Nahjul Balagha, he says that it is a pathway of rhetoric. That would be the appropriate title of the book, because for the reader it will open the doors of eloquence. So anyone who reads it, they will take their Arabic and their understanding of the language to another level. He goes on to say that Amir al-Mu'mineen was the fountain of eloquence, the source of rhetoric. Through him, the hidden delicacies of eloquence and rhetoric, it came to light. From him, we were taught its principles and its rules. And he goes on to say that after he came, people, they tried to imitate his style. They walked in his footsteps. They learned about the importance of the mastery of language, but nobody could come close to the master himself. And he says the reason no one could come close is because, number one, he was the first and the foremost, but number two, because his words were a reflection of the divine knowledge of Allah and a savoring of the wisdom of Rasul al-A'zam Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Now, an important question may come to mind. The way that we're speaking about Nahjul Balagha and about the Imam, does this mean we are putting a book next to the Holy Quran or next to the ahadith of the Holy Prophet? This is an accusation which is sometimes leveled against the Shia of Ahlul Bayt. The simple answer to this is that it is a false dichotomy. Meaning that it's not a simple case. We have to choose either Quran or Nahjul Balagha, either the hadith of the Prophet or the words of Imam Ali alayhi salam. There's no rule which says that we have to have one and we have to leave the other. They're not mutually exclusive. Rather, they are supplementary. They are supportive of one another. And if we said that taking any book, taking wisdom from it in order to learn more about the Quran or to learn more about the Holy Prophet, that is tantamount to giving a partnership to the Holy Quran, then we have to throw out every single book of tafsir that we have. Imagine you pick up a book and it says the Holy Quran, but it has the name Ibn Kathir on it, or it has the name Shaykh al-Tabrizi, or Alama Tabatabai, or any of the great Mufassirin, Jalaluddin al-Suyuti, Fakhruddin al-Razi, Zamakhshari, whoever it is. We have to throw them all out. Wal-'iyadu billah. Of course not. Because they help us to understand the Holy Quran. They peel back some of the layers. They give us an angle and a type of wisdom that we otherwise didn't have without reading them. So it is no more a partner to the Holy Quran than these great works of any of the ulama. It is a supplement. It is not in opposition. And when it comes to the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He actually instructs us in the Quran to look for ways to get close to Him. In Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse number 35, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَابْتَغُوا إِلَيْهِ الْوَسِيلَةَ وَجَاهِدُوا فِي سَبِيلِهِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ. O believers, be mindful of Allah and seek whatever means bring you closer to Him. Whatever we can find which is within the boundaries of halal, that takes us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we should use it. And anyone who has opened the pages of Nahjul Balagha, they will find that it drips in love for the Almighty. And you can walk away from opening that book only with more love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
And similarly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in Surah Al-Imran, verse number 7, He says, وَمَا يَعْلَمُ تَأْوِيلَهُ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ يَقُولُونَ آمَنَّا بِهِ. And no one knows the interpretation, referring to the Holy Quran, no one knows the interpretation of the Quran except Allah and those firmly rooted in knowledge. Now, the meaning of this part of the verse, it depends very heavily on where you put the full stop. Some people, when they translate it or when they understand it, they will stop by saying that no one knows the interpretation except God. They put the full stop there. And those firmly rooted in knowledge, they say we believe in it. Others will say no. Rather, it reads, none know its interpretation except God and those firmly rooted in knowledge. So God knows the interpretation and those firmly rooted in knowledge. And then the next word, which is the fi'al mudari', it's a present tense verb. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, they say, we believe in it. Now, to dissect this in depth is beyond the scope of tonight's discussion. But at the very least, there is that implication, there's that understanding of this verse, which opens the door to going to the people of dhikr, to going to the people who have more knowledge. And inshallah, in the night that we've devoted to knowing the relationship between the Holy Quran and Nahjul Balagha, we'll go in a lot more depth in this specific context. So, with respect to the Holy Quran, it tells us that we should seek wasilas. We're not putting it next to the Quran. Now, regarding the ahadith of the Holy Prophet, Imam Ali alayhi salam makes it very clear. He says, in sermon number 89, by Allah, whatever the Prophet told them, I am here telling them the same. Whatever you hear today is not different to what you heard yesterday. So he's saying that when you have many of the words of the Imam, he's reflecting the wisdom of the Holy Prophet, who is indeed his teacher. And in fact, this is necessary for the development of Islam. He says in Nahjul Balagha, saying 465, about the Ansar, he's complimenting those who supported the Holy Prophet in Medina. He says, by Allah, they nurtured Islam with their generous hands and with their eloquent tongues, just as a 1-year-old calf is nurtured. But having said all of that, it would be disingenuous to stop there, because we are not taking the words of Imam Ali alayhi salam and putting them on the same level as, say, Ibn Kathir, or on the same level as any other alim of history. We still say that they are above. Hence we have that saying, دون كلام الخالق وفوق كلام المخلوق. That it is below the words of the Creator. Yes, it is absolutely below the Quran. but it is above the words of the creation, meaning any other ordinary person that has written whatever sermons or letters or sayings, they fall short of the Imam. So it is in a different category. But to state this is quite logical. And we can come across this in two ways, one by inference and the other by direct proof. In terms of inference, the man who opened his eyes in the hands of the Holy Prophet was Imam Ali alayhi salam. He was the shadow of the Holy Prophet for his entire life. He had that privileged access to him. He was his cousin. He was his adopted son. He was his son-in-law. He was the one who laid the Holy Prophet in the ground to rest. And the lineage of Rasul al-A'zam, it continued through him. There was no one closer to the Holy Prophet. It was no ordinary relationship. It was one that was forged in the stars. And the Holy Prophet, he makes reference to his love for Imam Ali. There's that famous hadith in Sahih Muslim, in the book of the merits of the companions. Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, one of the companions of Rasulullah, is asked by Muawiyah, why don't you curse Imam Ali? And he responded, I can never curse him because of three virtues that he has. And one of the three is that on the day of Khaybar, Rasulullah said he will give the standard to someone who loves Allah and His Messenger, and someone who Allah and His Messenger also love. And everybody wanted to be the one who received that standard, but it was none other than Ali ibn Abi Talib. But he was not only beloved by Allah and beloved by the Prophet, but he was the most beloved, the closest. There is quite an interesting hadith. Ibn Kathir, he records it in al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya, and he gives 90 different people that narrate it from Anas ibn Malik. And in this tradition, the Holy Prophet, he receives a gift, a cooked chicken, a roasted chicken. And he raises his hands to the heavens and he says, Ya Allah, please send your most beloved creature to eat this meal with me. Now the Holy Prophet, he did this out loud. Two of his wives were present, Lady Aisha and Lady Hafsa. They wanted their fathers, the first Khalifa Abu Bakr, the second Khalifa Umar ibn al-Khattab, they wanted them to be the ones for whom these words applied. And so they called their fathers. The first Khalifa came, Rasulullah politely declined. The second Khalifa came, Rasulullah politely declined. Anas ibn Malik, who's the narrator and other of the Sahaba, he said, I wanted it to be Sa'ad ibn Ubadah, someone from my own tribe. And so when Ali ibn Abi Talib came, I stopped him. And he tried to come in 3 times. I stopped him 3 separate times until Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi himself. Until he himself came out and he said, please admit Ali ibn Abi Talib. So he was the most beloved and he was the closest to the Holy Prophet in terms of the amount of time that he spent. So it is logical, it is reasonable to infer that he had access to some knowledge from the Holy Prophet that other people did not have, to more depth, for example, to more breadth, whatever it might be. But that's indirect, that's inference. We also have very direct evidence as well that the knowledge of Imam Ali alayhi salam was above anybody else. For example, there is the tradition which is recorded in Sahih Tirmidhi and also in Al-Hakim's Mustadrak, where the Holy Prophet says, Ana Madinatul Ilm wa Aliyun Babuha. I am the city of knowledge and Ali is its gate. And this hadith, it has been accepted, it has been seen as authentic, or at least it has been seen as sound by a lot of the great scholars of hadith. Al-Hakim in his Mustadrak, he says that it is Sahih. Other scholars of hadith like Suyuti, Sakhawi, and even Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, they all agree that this hadith, it is acceptable, at the very least, that it is not a fabrication, that it is not a weak hadith. And there is no surprises here, because whenever we compliment the first Imam, we always back it up with some of the actions of Imam Ali alayhi salam. We don't just throw adjectives at him, because he earns every single one of the accolades that he receives from the Holy Prophet. He was the one who never bowed before any idols. A lot of people, when they say his name, they say Karim Allahu wajhahu, that may Allah brighten his face, because his face was the only one of the major Sahaba that did not fall down in worship before anything other than God. He was the one who was brought up by the Holy Prophet. He was literally raised by him. So he had that special access. and that knowledge. And remember, Rasulullah is educated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the knowledge goes from Allah to Rasulullah to Imam Ali. And he bears witness to his special access. In Ibn Sa'd's Tabaqat, he writes, this is a book from the school of Ahl Sunnah, an authoritative book. He says, I used to have private sessions with the Prophet until there was not a single verse of the Quran that he had not related to me and given me its entire interpretation. So when we give the Imam this special privileged station and we say, yes, his words are below the words of the Creator. Yes, his words are below that of the Holy Prophet. But they are above that of any other author. The reason we do that is, number one, because indirectly he was the one who had most access to the knowledge of the Holy Prophet, and directly Rasulullah bared witness to the superiority of his language and his love for him.